Well, here we are again, my little chickadees. So last time we left off with the Seventh Ecumenical Council, the Seventh Ecumenical Council in the history of the Catholic Church, Christianity, Nicaea II, Second Council of Nicaea, in the year 787. And I promised you that we would not be going in depth into the remaining councils of a total of 21 in the history of the Catholic Church. But why were these first 7 ecumenical councils so important? Because they were, or they remain, the only ecumenical councils. So we're talking 800 years of, more or less, of Christianity that still today all Christians continue to agree on. Roman Catholics, the Eastern Orthodox, and at least mainline Protestant denominations. That is, all the doctrines, the teachings contained, deliberated, and agreed upon in these councils, at least today, as of 2020, Christians still agree upon. And that is why these first 7 ecumenical councils are so important and fundamental to understanding Christianity. And of course, interrelational, we say ecumenical. Negotiations, dialogue, conversation among them. Okay, so the first 7 ecumenical councils, that's why they're so important, right? With that said, this particular lecture session for RL 221, Popes of Rome, History of the Catholic Church, for that matter, THL 360, History and Theology of the Papacy, we pick up week 6.2 with this recorded lecture session. Okay, so this is week 6.2 as per your worksheets. Week 6.2. Going down immediately to the first number here, Roman numeral 1, or number 1, Dark Ages Part 2, 476 to 800 CE. We already mentioned last lecture session that in 476, the Ostrogothic barbarian chieftain Odoacer deposed, meaning dethroned, the Western Roman Emperor, Romulus Augustulus, and usurped, just took over control of the Italian peninsula. This begins the formal, if you will, barbarian control in the Dark Ages, the early medieval period of the Italian peninsula and the greater European continent. What was a barbarian? Usually people think, okay, barbarian, ooh, that must have something to do with barba, like beard. Non, as we say or used to say in Italian. It's a bit antiquated. Non, no. The ancient Greeks, so we're talking already 1,000 years before the ancient Romans, right? So about the year 1000 BC. To the ancient Greek ear, any language that was spoken, that they heard, that was not Greek, sounded dumb, stupid, like ba 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 ba, blah blah blah, which is why they invented a term in Greek called barbaroi. You speak ba ba ba. barbaroi. You're barbaric. So first of all, that's where the term comes from. Now, the Romans picked up on that because they famously emulated and were rather envious of ancient Greek, Hellenic, and later Hellenistic culture. The barbarian invasions were already something that existed in ancient Rome, even during its heyday, even before the empire, so during the Republican period. Continued throughout the imperial period, but once the empire collapses in 476, these so-called barbarians wind up taking over. Famously, two groups in the Western Roman Empire, the Vandals we call them, who conquested the Iberian Peninsula, so modern-day Spain and Portugal, and subsequently into North Africa, the former Roman provinces of Mauritania and Carthage. So throughout North Africa, vandalizing, hence that's how we get the name, the Vandals. They run amok. They vandalized. The Vandals run amok in these areas. In terms of Central Europe and the Italian peninsula, the primary group was of so-called barbarians were known as the Goths. The Goths. And no, we are not condescendingly or insultingly referring to a group of, socially marginalized teenage mall rats. It's just what they were called, Goth. And there's two subgroups to this. The Visigoths, who kind of took over the western part of Europe, and the Ostrogoths, who focused on Central Europe and the Italian peninsula in particular, and that's where Odoacer, the guy that deposed Romulus Augustulus, leading to the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, took place in 476. So in 476, with Odoacer and the Ostrogoths invading the Italian peninsula, that's the end of the Western Roman Empire, and the only go-to guys left, if you will, in the Western Roman Empire are Christian bishops. Why? Well, one, as we've already learned, because thanks to Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century, Constantine made many Christian bishops his vicars and members of the College of Pontiffs in order to hear court cases. So they were already in an administrative role and capacity following the collapse of the Roman Empire. Secondly, most of them already came from or had experience within the Roman imperial bureaucratic, juridical, jurisdictional, governmental system. Thirdly, most Christian bishops were came from families that were of ancient Roman patristic nobility. So these are the go-to guys. However, they do not any longer have the backing formally of the Roman Empire. Maybe on paper, maybe officially, but practically speaking, they're on their own. And they don't know what to do. They have no armies. We have the monastery system now, which is coming into fruition, so we can somehow provide for the needs, the basic needs anyway, of other members of human society, but things are very, they're bad. This characterizes then the 5th and 6th centuries. Beginning in the early 7th century. So at the time of Pope Gregory the Great, which you will recall from the readings, which I'm sure all of you are meticulously following, Pope Gregory the Great, around the year 600, again, an ancient Roman patrician noble family, a Benedictine monk who eventually becomes elected Pope, Pope Gregory I, Gregory the Great, sends missionaries throughout the former Western Roman Empire to attempt to convert those who are not Christian to this particular religious faith. It's a mixed bag. Successes, failures, again, characteristic of the Dark Ages. At the same time that Pope Gregory the Great is doing this, yet another of these so-called barbarian groups will wind up invading the Italian peninsula. Another barbarian group that comes from Central Europe, basically modern-day Germany, crosses the Italian Alps and winds up subduing the Ostrogoths. This new group of barbarians is known as the Longobardi, or Lombards, from which the northernmost region of Italy, the industrial base, where this current thing, coronavirus, has emerged back in early February, happened. So Lombardia, Lombardy, the capital seat of which, both in ancient Rome as well as today, is the city of Mediolanum in Latin, or Milano in Italian, Milan, if you're in the UK, Milan. Okay. That's the 7th century, the 600s. They subdue the Ostrogoths, this new barbarian group, the Lombards. But it's from the perspective of the natives here in the Italian peninsula, things don't really change much. That is to say, disorganization, collapse of civilization and society, etc., continue. So things are not very good in the Italian peninsula. Last lecture session, towards the end, we briefly spoke about the rise of the Islamic Caliphate and conquesting not only what remained of the Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, but even beyond that, all the way to India, to the east, as well as to the south of France, we said by the year 732. And in the year 732, another monumental moment occurred that would continue to shape the future development of what is quickly becoming medieval Christendom and the rest of the world. And that is due to a group of yet another set of barbarians known as the Merovingians. This was a very loosely confederated group of tribes from Central Europe, we would say modern day France and Germany, and so they're referred to as the Franks and the Germans. So very loose confederation of these tribes, Franks and Germans, collectively referred to as Merovingians. And in the year 732, following a series of decisive battles in the south of France, Tours, Poitiers, Toulouse, the Merovingians, led by their chieftain, a guy by the name of Charles Martel, Charles Martel. Martel in French, or in Italian, martello. In English, it means hammer. Charles the Hammer, Charles Martel, managed in the year 732, leading his band of merry Merovingians, to hammer back the Islamic Caliphate from the south of France all the way back at least to the southern portion of the Iberian Peninsula, so southern Spain, which is where they would remain until the 15th century, farther on. Well, news of this spread immediately everywhere throughout the continent of Europe, the former Western Roman Empire, through the former Eastern Roman Empire, now what they refer to as the Byzantine Empire. Remember, the former name of Constantinople was Byzantium. Okay. And even farther east. So it was an incredible occasion. And of course, the popes here in Rome got wind of this. And the Pope said, wow, we think we can work with these guys, and we want to work with these guys, the Merovingians, Charles Martel. Why? Well, number one, they have obviously demonstrated their capabilities militarily, because in over a century, they're the only military warfaring collective army from India to the east, India to the south of France, that for the first time has been able to halt the assault of the Islamic Caliphate. So they're militarily capable and worthy of the challenge. Therefore, they may be able to help us. This is the popes now, right, here in Rome. They may be able to help us squelch, get rid of, contain these other barbarian groups, namely the Ostrogoths, the Lombards, etc. Now, why in the world would the popes favor this particular barbarian group, the Merovingians, versus these other barbarian groups, Ostrogoths, Lombards, etc.? Because by now, Pope Gregory the Great's missionary efforts have borne fruit. Because this group of barbarians, the Merovingians, they were all Christian. And consequently, the popes here in Rome invite Charles Martel, the Merovingians, to invade the Italian peninsula and get rid of these other marauding barbarian groups, Lombards, Ostrogoths, etc. This is the year 732. By the year 754, so again, just a couple of decades later, this will come to fruition. Now, at this point, Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer, is dead. However, his son, Pepin, in French, Pepin, the short, not to be confused with Pepin, the fat, who was another later descendant of this group. Pepin the Short and his son Carloman and his son Charlemagne, they would take up this task. So they lead this merry band of Merovingians across the Alps in the north of Italy, the border between France, Switzerland, now Liechtenstein, and Österreich, Austria. They cross the Alps, invade Italy, and they subdue the entire Peninsula, driving what remains of the Lombards and the Ostrogoths out of the peninsula all the way south onto the island of Sicilia, Sicily. Game over for now. Now, for the Pope's part, and at this point it's Pope Stephen II. The first Pope to take that name, Stephen, if you remember back to the baptismal controversy between Cyprian of Carthage, the Bishop of Carthage, and Pope Stephen I, the Bishop of Rome, back in the middle of the 3rd century. Pope Stephen II, this guy now, the year 754, for this effort on the part of the Merovingians, he grants to Pepin, Carloman, and Charlemagne the ancient Roman title under Roman law of Patricius Romanorum, patrician of the Romans. This was the ancient Roman title of nobility. And in other words, this is the birth of European nobility. So if you think in the past, when people think especially of the colonial period, the 16th, 17th centuries, in the so-called New World, North and South America, the Pacific theater, the coast of Africa, all of these kingdoms, right? The Spanish crown, King Ferdinando and Queen Isabella. Or even more recently, still in the 21st century, Queen Elizabeth of England, and of course her bat-eared dauphin of a son, Charles. Where does all that come from? All this nobility, European nobility, yeah? This is when it begins. And once again, it's important to note, how is it beginning? Through the Pope, who, remember, is the Pontifex Maximus. We'll come back to that point later, obviously, as well. All of the land, all the territory, the geographical territory in the European continent, which the Merovingians take over, conquest, all of the land north of the river Pio, the river Po, which if you cut the Italian peninsula off at the continent, everything north of that, the Merovingians keep for themselves, which is basically most of the continent of Europe. Most of the modern European nation states, the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal, Spain, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, if that is a country, Germany, Austria, Slovenia, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, the western portion of Poland, pretty much the entire European continent. The Merovingians keep from themselves, which will eventually become, shortly after this, which we're coming to, something known as the Holy Roman Empire. For Pepin's part, so the Merovingians, their part, they give to the popes, in this case specifically, again, Pope Stephen II, 754, they grant all of the territory south in the Italian peninsula, south of the River Po, again, cut the Italian peninsula off at the continent, all the territory, geographical territory, most of it, from south of the River Po all the way almost down to Napoli, almost down to Naples. So almost the entire central third of the Italian peninsula, that territory they cede, which they conquered, but they cede it to Pope Stephen II, to the popes. And this then is the beginning, the formal beginning, 754, of what until the year 1870 will be recognized as the Papal States. In English we say the Papal States, the rulers of which are the popes. So now, suddenly, starting in 754, the popes are not only as successors of Rock, remember that? Simon Peter, that office. So they not only have some sort of spiritual authority, they are now not merely conveniently go-to guys administratively, etc., because they have that experience, because they were already members of the Roman imperial bureaucracy, deep state, whatever you want to call it. But now they're formally recognized as actual sovereign temporal rulers of a very large and most strategic location in the Mediterranean basin, the African continent, the European continent, and the near Middle East. The popes. That's the year 754. Their territory, technically the southernmost boundary extends, of the Papal States I'm talking about here, extends to a small town called Gaeta, Gaeta. It's on your worksheet if you're following it. Gaeta. It's a town on the Mediterranean coast, roughly about halfway between Rome and Naples. To the south, there's a very, very famous, at least locally, lovely tasting olive called the Gaeta olive. Very small. When it's ripe, it becomes almost black. It's really dark purple, but sometimes it becomes almost black. Sharp taste, very good. It takes its name from this town. Anyway, I digress. Okay. This will all finally culminate here in Rome on Christmas Day in the year 800. By Christmas Day in the year 800, Pepin the Short is dead. His son Carloman is dead. The only one left is Charlemagne. And famously, on Christmas Day in the year 800, Charlemagne, inside of St. Peter's Basilica, here in Rome, will be crowned the first ever Holy Roman Emperor. The first of almost a millennium-long line of Holy Roman Emperors, so-called. It's Pope Leo III who will crown Charlemagne, coronate him, inside of St. Peter's Basilica. The important thing to take note of here at this point is that it's always the Pontifex Maximus not only involved, but actually doing this. The difference is now that the Pontifex Maximus is no longer an elected position in the ancient Roman Republic or even the Roman Emperor. The Pontifex Maximus now is undecidedly the Pope. And this begins what will become one of the great debates in the medieval period, which we'll come to in a later future lecture session, the debate between de jure pontificio, pontifical right and authority, versus de jure divino, loosely translated into English as divine right of kings. Who has more power? The Pope as Pontifex Maximus, or the Emperor, or for that matter, a king?